Nigel is started his life, I think, doing theology here in Cambridge, didn't you? And has been through various different pathways and is now the director, or the president, sorry, of the Center for Policy on Emerging Technologies in Washington, D.C. And he's particularly interested in the impact of robots and robotics on the world of work. I think that's what you're going to talk about to us today. Thank you very much, Nigel.
Well, thank you very much for this very kind invitation. It's a treat to be back in Cambridge and to be back here at the invitation of Faraday. I was saying I've been quite a great admirer of Faraday's work. I never actually involved. Very nice to be invited. I visited once or twice over the years and know Dennis a little bit, and it's been good to see Bob, who a contemporary of mine in the old days here in Cambridge. It's a treat to be here. I've lived in the States now for just over 25 years, and I hope maintained my accent. But I will tell you a story, since it's the afternoon slot. I'll indulge you for a little story before we get into some rather depressing material here. That sort of, yes, well, that you can start to drift off at this point. Shortly after we moved to the States in 1991, I was out doing some shopping in the local supermarket. And the girl at the checkout, we called them girls back then at checkouts, was being very chatty. I mean, in the States, people are very, retail is a wonderful piece. People talk to you. It's a very much more sociable environment. Of course, here in the UK, they talk to each other while they serve you. And she said, where are you from? So I said, I'm from Edinburgh in Scotland. I'm British. She said, how long have you been here? I said, oh, actually less than a week. She said, your English is very good. Well, mercifully, after 25 years, my English is still in reasonable order, but you may catch me out at one or two points. We shall see. My attention was first drawn to this particular question of the impacts of robotics AI on employment best part of 10 years ago. There have been various discussions in the last few days of the singularity, Ray Kurzweil, and his enthusiasm for applying Moore's law to his personal future and our futures and so on. And I have tracked with these people. I rather admire them. And for several years, I went quite regularly to their conferences out on the West Coast. And they were, Kurzweil is something of a cult figure. Well, he is a cult figure. And you would have a room there in San Jose or somewhere of maybe 400 or 500, almost entirely men, almost entirely 34 years old, mostly wearing sweaters that hadn't been washed recently. A very distinctive sort of culture there. I mean, if you've been to these things, you know I'm not making this up. And then the great Kurzweil would perform, and he would have guests come and perform in ways that obviously were agreeable to him. And occasionally he would debate people. I mean, he would invite someone and then he would debate them. And yes, sort of a certain amount of cringing is required here because, of course, he would always win the debate. So I went to these things because these are people raising really smart questions about the fundamental shifts which are taking place, and in particular, just quite dramatic shifts taking place because of current and prospective advances in artificial intelligence. And I like hanging out with people on the extremes of everything because this is where the signals come from, the indicators of not necessarily the direction of progress, but certainly the questions to be raised about it. So I was at one of these events when a rather unsurprising presentation was made by a man who has one of the most wonderful names in the world, Marshall Brain. Who wouldn't wish to be called Marshall Brain? And it's a real name. He's not a transhumanist with a made-up name like some of them do. He's really called Marshall Brain. Marshall Brain was the founder of the website that probably most of you know, How Stuff Works, which was an early, very successful website. I think he sold it before the dot-com bust. I'm sure he's done very nicely for himself. He's a computer science professor. And also a very, very nice guy. I've had some contact with him since. And Marshall was given this marvelously Kurzweilian title for his presentation, Preparing for a Second Intelligent Species. So, the room of 400, guys in sweaters was agog. And Marshall began. Marshall put up on a screen there's a sort of cut-down version of the US Department of Labor job classifications. That's I think 903 different job classifications they have, if I get that right. And there's a cut-down one-pager, which if you're an American, you see in various tax contexts for saying the kind of job you do. And he put this up on the screen, the one-pager. And he went through the categories, one after the other. And the audience was, sort of shuffling a little bit, and because he was obviously coming up with bad news. And having gone through all these different job classifications and talked about the context in which he thought they would end up under the sway of AIs, and concluding that basically half the jobs in the United States would go within a generation to AIs, which of course is almost exactly the same number as our friends over in Oxford came up with in their recent report, 47%. And Marshall was just doing this on the fly. The audience was not happy. And so time comes for Q&A, and a hand goes straight up, and there was no calling of the hand. The man just shouted out, "Professor Brain," he said, "are you familiar with an academic discipline called history?" Well, if you didn't get that, then, well, you can work on it in your own time. Point is, it perfectly symbolized the problem we have here. Because in the past, every single time we have had a technological revolution, whether the big industrial revolution, British style, or the late 19th century cluster of revolutions in all sorts of technologies, or the digital revolution of generation, whenever we have had this, people have been saying there will be no more jobs, and every time we've come out of it with more jobs, better jobs, more value, and so on. And this exchange between Marshall and the unnamed person with the hand that went up with a sweater around the arm, it captures a discussion which ought to have the developed world in thrall, but does not. A couple of little stories. About 4 or 5 years after that, I was out in Silicon Valley, in Palo Alto, having lunch with a pair of lawyers, senior partner and the number 2 in the Valley office of a big international law firm, a senior member of whose was chairing my advisory board. And he said, "You should meet these people out in the Valley." And very, very just delightful lunch. For those of you who know Valley culture, it was no surprise that the number 2 guy owns a vineyard. So, of course, we're all drinking his wine. He makes sure we do that. And this is the way things go out there. It really is rather pleasant. And I was trying to pitch CPET, looking for contacts and so on. I've got this think tank. As some of you know, you run a charity, you run a non-profit, and your life is trying to keep this thing going, which means money. But that wasn't the conversation they wanted to have. I mean, they were quite nice to me, but I mean, within 5 minutes, the senior partner said to me, "Nigel," he said, "you tell me when we will be involved as a law firm with a startup, whether we're working with the VCs or whether we're working directly with the entrepreneur, technologists, you tell me when, just one, which will create more jobs than it destroys." This was their agenda for that lunch. And about 2 weeks later, I was back in DC at some dinner, and I happened to be next to a person whose job title was Assistant Secretary for 21st Century Workforce. You may know in the US government, we have this marvelous thing called the Plum List, which is a list of 7,000 jobs which are politically appointed. Well, they're called non-competitive appointments. That sweet little phrase is used. And she was one of the, we have a lot of assistant secretaries. People go around saying, "I'm an assistant secretary." Well, there are quite a lot of assistant secretaries. But this was her title. So I said, "Oh, guess what? I was out in Silicon." And I said, "Who on your team is working on the question of the blah, blah, blah?" And she said, "Oh, no, that's not something we talked about." And this conversation has been repeated. And I then called up my contact at the AFL-CIO, which is the American trade union, American TUC, who worked with us on some projects on nanotechnology, workplace nanotechnology implications and so on, technology impacts on employment. And I said to him, "Is it you, or whom should I be speaking to at AFL, looking at the question of the impact of blah, blah, blah on employment?" And he said, "No," he said, "there's nobody here working on that." I said, "What about your member unions?" No, he said, no, he said, "I would know." So I said, "Well, maybe you should all drop what you're doing and start thinking about this." And one could repeat the stories. Now, it isn't there aren't people out there thinking about these things, but it interests me, the people who are not thinking about these things. And the people with whom, when one raises these questions, respond in a way which is not so much disinterested as filled with sympathy. You two are with the Luddites, is the sentiment one receives. Luddite, of course, is a very powerful word. I think the only word which comes close to it in shutting down conversations is the word fundamentalist. You use either of these words in conversation, and the conversation just veers off the table. There's a time when perhaps you do want to use them, and certainly more than once when I've been accused of being Luddite, I have said, you are an economic fundamentalist. I said, you see, let's try talking about this again and not using these epithets. So I got myself drawn somewhat unintentionally into these conversations, and as some of you will know, once you begin talking about something you know not very much about, A, you learn a little bit about it, B, people think you know a lot more about it, and C, you get invitations. So, I mean, I've spoken about the World Bank. Last fall, I had a fun trip to Hong Kong, where I was first opener for the Economist magazine's Asia Innovation Conference, and so on. So one has had a certain amount of screen time on this issue, and in the process, I actually learned a little bit about it. It crosses discipline. This is the problem with it. It's not an issue for economists. There's no economic theory that says you're going to have jobs for everybody all the time. It just isn't like that. As the economists themselves, of course, have been telling me on these occasions. The World Bank economists were fascinated by this. They said, we've never talked about this, they said. But I'm so glad you raised it with us, development economists. The Oxford people have produced another report since, by the way, which suggests that developing economies are going to be hit even harder by the impact of AI robotics. So I've gone around, and I've now written a little book which is coming out in the spring from Polity, which is just down the road here in Cambridge. They've got a series of little quick books, so you can say dangerous things and then run away and hide, but you can't make, really, there's not enough room for enough footnotes to hide properly. So that will do for me with another crowd of my academic friends who think that I've spent my time wandering off the reservation. What I like to do is to try to frame this discussion for us. I'm not making a case here, except for the fact that there is a case to be made. I don't know what the future is. I am pretty sure from the people I've spoken to, many of whom have been very convinced they do know what the future is on both sides of this discussion, that they don't know what it is either. It's plain that the discipline of history, Professor Brain, does indeed teach us that in the past, industrial revolutions, technological innovations have netted out as more value, more jobs, better jobs. The process has sometimes been grim. One of the little things I ferreted out, because there's not a lot of actual direct address to these issues, the chief economist at the Bank of England made a very interesting speech at the TUC a few years ago, which you can find. You can find everything by Googling it. And interesting piece of historical analysis. And he said that one of the impacts of the Industrial Revolution, in the UK, was to double the number of unskilled laborers from 20 to 40% of the workforce. And it took 2 generations before that was righted again. Go around and look at the Rust Belts. Look at our great cities, of course, which were shipbuilding centers and steel-making centers and so on. You have these here in the UK, we have these in the States, Detroit, Gary, Indiana, which is not very far from Chicago, where I lived for a long time. You may know, is named after the founder of US Steel, which was the mightiest corporation there was at the time. And every other year, it's now the murder capital of America. This sort of notion that, well, we pick up, industrial, there's a lot of footnotes necessary in the optimistic sweep, even if we're looking back at these developments. And of course, we all know of people, and many of us know people who have lost their jobs in these fading industries in midlife and have never worked again, and they've, in their 40s and 50s and so on, they've basically been retired early to put a positive spin on their situations. And so it seems to me part of the starting point for this discussion is that even if you accept the conventional wisdom, which is, of course, that these things always sort themselves out in the end, and you're a Luddite if you object, even if you accept the conventional wisdom, then industrial revolutions of all kinds come at a considerable price. There are time lags, there are big skills lags, there's social, economic, cultural, familial dislocation. And the bigger the impact of the Industrial Revolution, the bigger the impact of these things. And of course, in this current situation, if we anticipate a sort of mid-level set of expectations for the impacts on everything, including employment, of these developments in artificial intelligence, then we may expect not simply one Rust Belt. This isn't just shipbuilding going down or steel manufacturing going down. We're talking about gouging employment out of all sorts of sectors of the economy pretty much at the same time, which is why this is so exciting and so interesting, but potentially so catastrophic. And is even on the assumption that it will all net out as more value, more jobs, and everybody ends up still with this thing we call full employment, which is a very, very curious concept, because basically there's no sort of natural process here. Economists, governments, and so on, we need to keep this thing called full employment. You know, and whatever it is in the UK now, is it about 6% here, something like that, unemployment? And it's higher, of course, in the EU as a whole. It's around 6, 8, 10, 12%. We can manage this politically. But whether this number is going to continue, or whether, in fact, over time it's going to go up, is the second question. So I think initially we need to recognize there's going to be an awful lot of disruption down the line. The second question is whether that disruption is, as it were, self-righting, or whether it is not. And that is where I think it's entirely unclear. Now, let me do one or two different things. First of all, just the scare stories. I mean, the things that struck me most as suggesting how dramatic this really could be. And some of you will know, I mean, you know, Kodak at its height, dear, poor, sad Kodak, which I think is now still in business, basically selling off its IP. I have a good friend in Rochester, New York, and I've seen this from something of her point of view. But Kodak, at its height, had 145,000 corporate employees, plus, of course, a gazillion Photoshops all over the world. And Instagram, when Facebook bought Instagram for $1 billion, some of you may know this. Anyone know how many employees it had when Facebook bought it for $1 billion? 13. And WhatsApp is even more fun, because WhatsApp has been valued, when I was writing this originally, at $19 billion. And WhatsApp employed then 55 people. Now, these are historically absolutely novel experiences, when you have enormous amounts of capital involved and hardly any actual workers. And I'm not suggesting, of course, that everything's going to be WhatsApp and Instagram. But what is interesting is the creation now of goods and services which essentially are almost entirely generated by capital. Technology, yes, but basically by capital. And in which the labor factor in the creation of value has essentially been squeezed almost completely out. And I think we may plainly expect a lot of goods and certainly a lot of services to go exactly the same way as this Moore's law-driven AI curves keeps creeping up. So I find these very striking. Some of you will know that Norbert Wiener, you know, who is celebrated as the father of cybernetics back in the 1930s, 40s, famously said that robotics will provide us with the exact equivalent of slave labor. And this is an American, and he talks about the slave economy, about the slave economy of the Old South as the model for what it will be to have major applications of robotics in industrial production and so on and so forth. There's some very dramatic sort of outliers in these discussions that I think we need to have, I feel like, in our peripheral vision, even if they're not giving us models for what we may reasonably expect. Also, of course, and this is very contemporary, I mean, the self-driving car is probably the epitome of this potential new economy and all of its benefits and disbenefits and so on and so forth. And some of you will know a very interesting book by two writers, Levy and Murnane, Richard Murnane, in 2004, which was about the future of the economy in this sort of technologically refreshed and generated economy. And they made a famous, and I'm sure they find this entirely lamentable statement, a very strong statement in the book. Of all the things that might be done, a left-hand turn, of course these are Americans, a left-hand turn against traffic, that they simply could not conceive how the processes could be reduced to algorithms and so on, so that we could actually program a machine to make a left-hand turn against traffic. And that was 2004. Now, within 3 or 4 years, Google were doing that. And as you may know, this is an historic time, that Monday of last week, Uber began offering self-driving car service in Pittsburgh. Very interesting story. They've had this whole deal with the mayor of Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, some of you will know, is a very interesting town, not least because of its steel background. It's full of hills and bridges. It's very complicated. It's a very charming little town. I really like Pittsburgh. Uber has been let loose. You may know that, 2-3 years ago, they'd been funding research at Carnegie Mellon University, which, of course, is one of the top shops in the world for this stuff. And they stopped funding it and hired all the guys. They hired about 30 people from Carnegie Mellon, from the top to the bottom of the sort of academic food chain. Who knows how much they're paying them? I was just seeing the other day someone from the Valley saying apparently it costs around, the going rate for a top person in the robotic car area is $10 million. That's the sort of, it's like footballers. And anyway, so they hired, so yeah, it began last Monday. Well, there have been no crashes since. And apparently, if you get this, you press your Uber button, and it says, would you like the self-driving? It's experimental, and maybe it's a discount, I don't know. But then apparently there are two guys from the front. There's a guy, steering wheel, has his arms folded for emergencies and by law. Guy next to him with all sorts of machines. And anyway, this is now. And now this has scared some of the Valley companies who are working in this area, because they don't want the whole thing set back by 5 years. If we end up, you kill 5 school children or something in Pittsburgh, and then it's going to be more difficult to do. But this is Uber's, shall we say, well, hubris may be the term. Certainly their chutzpah, to be a little bit more objective. And plus these guys from Carnegie Mellon who obviously reckon that this is time for, time for prime time. So this is now. And 2004, Levy and Murnane, not going to happen. So I'm wary of people saying, no, it's not. The car thing as a case in point, there are 3.5, well, a different number for this, but the number that I believe is there are 3.5 million truck drivers in the US, professional. It is the top career for men in the US, being a truck driver. I mean, let's just say it's the most men in one employment slot drive trucks, 3.5 million. And there are around 5 million immediate support people involved with the truck industry. And of course, you've got cabs, which is another 2 or 3 million, who, interestingly, of course, Uber replacing the cabs as a transitional form to having the self-driving Ubers. I mean, people are planning to drive for Uber, God bless them. But I mean, I think Uber's wonderful. I think, as I was saying to someone earlier, it's very problematic in all sorts of ways, but it is amazingly convenient. And you haven't got it in Cambridge, have you? No, I think this is, yet to arrive. But the point is a transitional form. Uber obviously are planning straight to move as fast as they can to the self-driving model. And when you have the self-driving model, and I think that the smartest money is on this fundamentally shifting the whole model of auto ownership, car ownership. I don't know the UK figure. In the US, downtime for personally owned vehicles is 97%. Now, families in the States typically have more cars than people do here, so I'm sure here it's a bit higher than that. But if you're using your vehicle 3% of the time, 97% of that is sitting out there rotting or occupying garage space you're paying for, then the fundamental shift will happen. I mean, I'm not an economic reductionist, but I do know, unless there's a very good reason, people do things that are cheaper than other things. And so there's a reasonable expectation that if we Uberize personal city, even just city transportation, forget about all the mountains and rural roads and so on, which we make more complicated perhaps, we will see a collapse in the ownership of private cars. And certainly many people will have one private car rather than 2 or 3, and will use Uber for the other rides. And they'll get used to Uber or Uber's successors and competitors for the other rides. And I think we may reasonably expect a major contraction in the need for manufactured autos, because, of course, if you've got a self-driving vehicle, uptime can be 23 or 24 hours or whatever. This thing can be scooting around the town. And then, of course, you begin to hollow out retail car insurance, because the whole point about these vehicles is they'll be a lot safer. And this is one of the problems, of course, with risk management and the whole politics of these technologies. Is that, I mean, so far we haven't had a bad accident involving a self-driving vehicle, except for this guy who was misusing his Tesla, watching Harry Potter, apparently, when he ended up decapitating himself. But he wasn't. This was an abuse of the system. It wasn't meant to be used like that, which I think, interesting, has been picked up pretty much in the media. I think that the self-driving car image hasn't been harmed by that incident. But I mean, there have been no serious accidents involving self-driving cars being properly driven by the cars. But obviously, the point is, people are bad drivers. You know, we have this sense that this is a supreme human thing. We can drive. How can they possibly produce machines who are good? We are terrible drivers. Most of the time we drive, we aren't even thinking about driving. You know, they've done the research showing people, you know, following their eye movements when they do it on the screen. And apparently, if you're checking out, and many of us check out much of the time we drive, your eyes don't move so much. You focus on the road, but it's still reasonably safe to do it when you're thinking about something else. But you have much less peripheral vision. Of course, they can track the amount of time people spend not focused on what they're doing in this sort of automatic mode. We're terrible drivers. I mean, I hate to say this, but I think this is true of doctors as well. I mean, diagnosis is the main thing doctors do. Certainly frontline doctors do this, diagnosis. Most doctors are awful at diagnosis. You know, you find a really good one and you stick with them. I mean, they're a really good driver and really good, but that's the point. Things that we think we're really good at doing, we are not good at doing at all. And therefore, you may not find a machine that can do this perfectly, but doing it better than a human may not be all that hard. And I think one needs to have this sort of realism in looking at these things that we think are the sort of supremely complex human achievements in the labor market. So, yes, and then of course you have A&E to bring these two stories together. I mean, if you have far fewer accidents, you will need far fewer people working in accident and emergency services. And this might help the National Health Service, but it will damage US medicine because it's much more commercially based. Your market goes down because you have many fewer casualties to fix. And you follow this, and you begin to see that this self-driving car thing actually affects all sorts of areas of the economy. There's been discussions of how it will affect what in Britain is called short-haul air travel. It isn't an American term. Because if you're going to be traveling 300 miles to a meeting, you might prefer to get into a car, which will have a bed ready for you, and have it take you there so you arrive fresh for a meeting in the morning. The hotel industry might, obviously will go over to producing little booths where you can go and have a shower and so on and so on when the car takes you there before taking you to your meeting, rather than the traditional pattern, which of course half of Americans seem to spend their lives getting a flight somewhere, going to a hotel, and then going to a meeting. All sorts of ripples throughout the economy from just this one change. And I think it's important to grasp that. I've gone on about it longer than I intended to, but you all seem to be paying attention, and it is, after all, the afternoon. We could, of course, list the many areas where these advances are being made. What interests me particularly is that they are by no means confined to routine activities or an activity like driving, or even diagnosis, in which you can at least understand the notion of a machine doing this, because you're getting information and you're scanning the area and so on and so forth. And some of you will know this very interesting book by the Suskins. Suskind, père et fils, who are two British. One is an academic and one is an IT guy. In fact, he actually is the IT advisor to the Chief Justice or whatever you now have in the Supreme Court in London. And they produced a very, very interesting book called The Future of the Professions. And their view is pretty negative on the future of the professions as over against the fact that AIs are going to hollow out so much of the activity which we now regard as professional activity, and therefore very high-priced activity, whether in medicine or in law or in other areas. And, go read the book. Again, of course, we have something we've been discussing during this event is the way in which computers, which one would have thought were essentially very detached and mechanical, have increasingly been used to read emotion and engage with us at a sort of psychological level. And some of you will know the work of Ros Picard, who is a very serious evangelical Christian at MIT. She coined this term affective computing, which is a book title, and has a company called Affectiva. And the notion that sort of the whole sort of touchy-feely counseling psyche sort of area where you would have thought this would be the last redoubt of the need for real human contact, it is not so simple. So it seems to me it's a reasonable conclusion to draw that across the whole range of what we currently regard as human employment, there are significant inroads being made, which potentially, and whether you want to talk about 5, 10, 20, 25 years, I don't really care, but because the timelines are very, very hard to predict, are going to shift the landscape of employment. Now, the conventional wisdom is that there are always new jobs. And something they always roll out as an example in these contexts is search engine optimization. And they always say, who would have guessed there'd be such a thing as SEO? You know, back in 1975 or something, when the internet is beginning to be rolled out commercially. And then you say, well, give us some more examples, and how many people here are doing SEO, and so on and so forth. And of course, SEO is something which could be pretty readily done by AIs anyway. Maybe it isn't such a brilliant example of the new kind of job. But whether we're going to end up with jobs for people of all levels, all abilities, in an economy in which the speed of change is growing. Well, I mean, I'm going to go back and quote Keynes at you, the great Mr. Keynes, who, among other things, of course, was a wonderful writer, which wasn't, it wasn't the reason why he was quite so significant, but he's always a good read. And it was he who laid down a marker in this discussion, in his little, very charming essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, which was published originally in 1930. It was published in a London club magazine of all places, but it's been incorporated into other contexts. And I think just the way he expresses it, I think is really quite interesting, because he says we are being afflicted with a new disease of which some readers may not yet have been made aware, but of which they will hear a great deal in the years to come, namely technological unemployment. This means unemployment due to our discovery of means of economizing the use of labor, outrunning the pace at which we can find new uses of labor. He wonderfully catches this in this phrase. Means of economizing the use of labor, outrunning the pace at which we can find new uses of labor. And some of us are somewhat bemused by the notion that we will actually manage to produce new jobs fast enough to keep ahead of the curve of the development of application of AIs and so on. Now, let me ask this question. We have conventional wisdom, which most economists share, most editorialists share, most government people share. People like chief economists in government departments, this is pretty much their position, throughout the OECD, that don't worry, keep your hand steady, these things happen, don't worry. What do you do when that is the conventional wisdom, and then you have increasingly interesting, respected outlier voices? And that is our current situation. And so, just to give you a couple of samples here, we have Bill Gates, the great Bill Gates whom we all know and love and whose product we all use and hate. Bill Gates. And that didn't go down very well, did it? You're obviously all serious, Microsoft fans here. It decided to update itself and override what I was doing yesterday, and I still can't find one of the files that disappeared. Gates has been very outspoken on this issue, and I admire him for it. Technology over time, he read it maybe 3 years ago, he said this, technology over time will reduce demand for jobs, particularly at the lower end of skill set. He hasn't read the Suskind's book. 20 years from now, he says, labor demand for lots of skill sets will be substantially lower. I don't think people have that in their mental model. I think that's a nice way of putting it. I don't think people have that in their mental model. My second witness whom I'm calling here to challenge the conventional wisdom is Larry Summers. Now, for those who don't know, the omnipresent Larry Summers, former president of Harvard and former Treasury Secretary in the US, and one of the most prominent public intellectuals in the United States, who, of course, features famously in the Facebook film, if you've seen the film, Social Network. Well, someone plays his role, he plays his part there, but it's very much Larry Summers. He's a rather outspoken individual whom nobody has ever accused of being humble. So Larry Summers writes about the time when he was an undergraduate at MIT, and these issues were beginning to be discussed, and he's contemporary pretty much with some of us here, for this is back in the 70s or so. And he says there were two factions in those debates. There were the stupid Luddite people, and there were the smart progressive people. The stupid people thought that automation was going to make all the jobs go away, and there wasn't going to be any more work to do. Until a few years ago, I didn't think this was a complicated subject. The Luddites were wrong, and the beliefs in technology and technological progress were right. I'm not so completely certain now. And in a lecture which he gave 3 or 4 years ago, you can read this online, it's a formal lecture, he takes that as his point of departure and then discusses using the automated car example and comparing it, contrasting it with the question of horses, of course, and their labor, because they didn't, this is the thing, the horses didn't get new jobs. The horses went to the knacker's yard. Not all technology revolutions are good for everybody. But Larry Summers is now clearly in the column of those raising serious questions about this. And to my mind, even more interesting, although much less well known, is, if I could read my notes, it would certainly help. It may come back to me. Major conservative intellectual, Charles, I quoted him the other day. Somebody obviously didn't remember. Can't read my writing. Who had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about 9 months ago, which was then reproduced by the American Enterprise Institute, which is the huge pro-business think tank in Washington. It's conservative, but it's more pro-business than it is politically ideological. And he's arguing there for universal basic income. So a conservative intellectual arguing for UBI, which some of you will know is the notion you should ditch your welfare expenditure and put it into $10,000 pounds for everybody all the time. And this has been a major suggestion in response to the notion that unemployment will rise and jobs will become more difficult to retain and so on. And his argument is that this will be necessary because of the impact of robotics. And he says, going back to my initial illustration of Professor Brain, have you heard of his history? He says the case for this time is different has a lot going for it. So what do we make of all this? Well, the point that I have been going around suggesting to the various audiences prepared to listen is that governments need to see this as a question of risk. But let us say, at a minimum, if Larry Summers and Bill Gates think there could be a big problem here, quite apart from anybody else, I think we should take this seriously. And a lot of other people have been saying similar things. And let us say there's a 10% chance that there really is going to be a fall-off in the total capacity of our economies to produce traditional type employment. That after whatever ups and downs we get in the structural unemployment, which is inevitable with new technologies, that there will be a net fall-off, whether a continuing fall-off or just a drop to a new level. Then this is an entirely new experience for the developed economies. This has not happened before. And interestingly, some of you will know, governments typically win elections because unemployment goes up and down, which often isn't their fault at all, because it's to do with economic cycles. Government goes up, governments lose elections. Democracy is very, very sensitive to these employment numbers, which is why governments keep trying to find ways of redefining them and explaining them away. If there's a 10% chance, there'll likely be a drop in the baseline employment within the Western economies as these technologies are rolled out in 5, 10, 20 years within the foreseeable future. Then the West faces a crisis, which needs to be taken extremely seriously. Even if there's a 90% chance it won't hit us, a 10% chance we're going to hit by an asteroid, it would attract your attention. We now have, according to the New York Times, a 22% chance Mr. Trump will become president in a few weeks' time. That's certainly attracted the attention of some of us. It's a risk question. And it's very easy for us to fight on both sides of issues on which there's disagreement, when what we should be doing is building consensus around some sort of risk analysis and the need for prudential policy decision-making as we confront the potential implications of this 10% coming true. My personal view, having read so much of this stuff, is it's a good deal more than 10%. I think maybe 50-50. But I would not argue that. I think as a matter of argument, one can make a case, well, let's take this as a 10% possibility of an actual collapse in the baseline of employment within the developed economies. And this would be a crisis. It's certainly a crisis up there with issues like climate and issues like the refugee crisis and so on, the things governments are taking enormously seriously. Secondly, of course, In the process, and whatever the outcome, there are certainly going to be rust belts breaking out in various sectors of the economy. This seems to me to be absolutely plain as a pikestaff. And the fact that not one of our political leaders is out there having major conversations about that, even with a purely, optimistic view of the long-term implications, seems to me to be really quite derelict. I mean, I had an op-ed in the San Francisco Chronicle about a year ago, which of course was entirely ignored, about the 5 technology debates the then candidates ought to be having as they were preparing themselves for the 2 nomination processes. And for some reason, they weren't taken up by the moderators and these questions weren't asked. One of them was this one. And I had another op-ed in the San Francisco Chronicle about this, raising these specific questions and using these Kodak numbers and so on, which I think are rather inflammatory because they're easy to slap down and say, well, it's a ridiculous example because it isn't typical of anything. Hardly a word in response. And this was the San Fran Chronicle, which apart from the Mercury is the best read paper out there, in the Valley and the Bay Area. People don't want to talk about these things. And it seems to me that if we're prudent, we should. Now, I'll just say 1 or 2 more things about detail, just for a couple of minutes, and then I will cease. One is to refer you to these interesting reports which have come out from people who know a lot more about these things than most of us do, and have spent a great deal of time on the subject. The one that got a lot of press was 4 years ago now, a report from the 2 scholars associated with the James Martin Institute in Oxford, which is the Future of Humanity project. Mike Osborne, whom I know a little, and Carl Benedict Fry, whom I don't know, produced a very, very detailed report. Very interesting, actually. The text of it is interesting. I mean, the precursors to the numbers and the analysis. And the analysis, they go through they begin with 903 or whatever the US Department of Labor classification is, and they get down to 700 and something by deciding that, auditors and accountants are really the same thing. And then they go through it every single job, one at a time. This must have been mind-numbingly boring work, but they did it, or maybe they got researchers to do it for them. And they come up with some sort of formula, and you can see the statistics there, and they go through every one of these jobs. And their conclusion is 47% of jobs from the current US economy are, within the next 20 years or so, going to go. And there's another 20-something% which are possibly going to go. And the top of the list, for the one most likely to go, telemarketers. And who will grieve their passing? The other end, if you want to know what you should be training to do, recreational therapists. I'm not quite sure what recreational therapists are, but plainly we should all be wanting to be one. And in between that, you have another, 699 categories. Now, there's been a response to this from the OECD. OECD, as they say, the UN without the poor nations, the OECD set up a working party which came to a very different conclusion, although you have to read these reports, because the OECD report accepts quite a lot of what the Oxford guys are saying. The OECD comes up with a headline number of 9%. Using basically the same data, and they have other considerations they add, and some of the critics of the Oxford report, and there have been various articles written about it, they've typically said this sort of thing. Well, for example, they said the Oxford guys assume that the main task that is performed in an occupation is the occupation. And that in fact occupations consist of all sorts of things. And you can actually, you can turn the main task into something which you can automatize. But other things will happen and the job will continue. And then you look at issues like licensure issues. And of course in the US they have, probably in the UK it's as bad, but in America, oh my goodness, you've got to be licensed to cut people's fingernails and so on. And licenses. All sorts of structures controlling jobs. Which actually have become significantly heavier over the last generation in the US, state licensure issues. But you think things of that kind. And you have ethical issues. I mean, do we really want to have machines doctoring our babies rather than have doctors doctoring our babies? Are there ethical, well, of course, you could say the ethical issue there is you want the best thing out of it. But there's a whole, and so they say we're taking these considerations, in fact, these soft considerations more seriously, and they come up with a figure of 9%. And so somewhere between those, it seems to me, we have a reasonable prediction. The Oxford people then produced a second report, which Citibank sponsored much more recently, with a bunch of development economists. Now, my assumption, wandering around these discussions, is that in the developing economies, the situation would be much safer, because, of course, labor costs are much lower. Not so simple. This second report gave a figure of more than 60% for the first tranche of jobs likely not to be there in developing economies in the course of the next 20 years. So I commend you to reading these documents. They're not particularly interesting, except the first part of the 47% report actually is really quite a good read for the way it discusses historically the way that these things have been assessed. But those numbers are there. The self-driving car technology is there, which seems to me to be leading the way in showing quite how dramatic the implications of roboticization are. Even as we tussle with the question of whether we should be nice to robots or it matters if we kick them down the stairs or they get killed in car crashes, even though we feel sort of migraine coming on as we listen to what Martin Rees was saying, about the billion years and these new life forms which will take over from mere Homo sapiens down the line, there are some very immediate, very practical questions here. What I've been doing when I've been talking to policymakers has been saying, let's say this is 10% likely. Let's say it's 70% likely we're going to have huge disruption, even if we end up pulling out of it. And let's begin to look at every single employment and social policy area and review it in order that we might be better prepared for coming turbulence in our labor markets. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Comments and questions? Yes, sir.
Doesn't history show us that people's working hours has been decreasing steadily over the last maybe 200 years? And isn't this just an extension of that question? That's the question.
Well, my working hours haven't been diminishing over the last 200 years.
No, but you accept that we're not working on Saturday. We're at a course, so we're. I suppose one way to construe this would be as a dramatic uptick in the pace at which, obviously, efficiencies are coming in and productivity is going up. Interestingly, one of the big pushback arguments from some economists is that productivity is not going up particularly fast. The technology, just is not having that sort of effect so far. But I think this is a prospective conversation. I'd be happy with that way of framing the issue. The thing is, when you are working 0 hours, plainly two questions arise. First of all, is how you're going to pay your electricity bills. But the second question is, what on earth are you going to do? Keynes has a lovely little line in his essay where he says something like, that the laboring man during his laboring hours wants nothing more than to lay down his tools and go home until he goes home. And of course, then he's bored to tears, because that was before Netflix, But it's this question, how do we spend our time? The thing I did down in Brazil a couple of years ago, which you can find on YouTube if you really want, I said, well, this is heaven or hell. What does this mean? And of course, if we're provided for and we can use our time, this is heaven. Forget heaven up there. This is heaven below. If we either can't use our time or don't have enough money to survive, or both, it's absolute hell. And the evidence is people retire. They begin to die. What does one do? What do the wealthy do? This is what interests me. People like the Gateses, Bill and Melinda Gates. But wealthy people typically make up jobs for themselves. They have sort of pretend jobs. They set up philanthropies and go around the world and watch their appointments and so on and so forth. Either nobly, as the Gateses, they're giving away all that money they've ripped off from us from Microsoft. I don't like Microsoft, do I? Or, in the case of the typical, the well-heeled of New York City, for example, and I'm sure of London, but I think in New York City, you probably get a lot more charitable activity going on here. But they all want to be on the board of the Met, and the board of MoMA and so on. And they have all these meetings and they rush around doing good. Whether or not they're charitably disposed, this is just a cost and it makes them feel... So very, very few people do nothing with their time, whether they're required to economically or whether they construct an environment in which they're required to by social pressure. And I'd love to have some examples of people who are not really quite extraordinarily unusual people who can basically wake up every day and spend their time in a fulfilling way and go to bed at night without either basically, being on heroin, or just being glued to video games all the time or whatever it is. And this, I think, has profound implications for our educational system.
because, you know, I have a student, a meeting I spoke at a while ago at university, she stood up and said, so what you're saying is our education system should prepare me so that when I'm 22, I can retire. And what we're doing, we're pushing people into STEM. Oh, my goodness. Okay, wonderful, but what does STEM do? It trains you for the things that are high on the list of these guys, because anything which is STEM-related will be easier for machines to do. And certainly at the end of the day, it's the humanities. It's our notion of what it is to be human. And of course, if we're religious, it's our faith. But it's all this soft stuff which gives our life meaning other than the life of the workplace. And I think that is where we should be pushing a huge amount of effort.
Some more questions, comments? John, come.
Thanks so much. Just thinking aloud about distinctively Christian responses, and particularly, you know, these ideas that God is a worker, about the dignity of work, the traditional Christian responses. How do these things change? In how might those kind of narratives change in this wonderful new world?
Well, you know, we're all haunted by the rather grim imagery in Genesis, you know, of eating by the sweat of our brow. You know, there's rather potent Hebraism. And obviously there have been people at all times who have not needed to sweat their brows to eat. And we have, if you like, the punishment side of this. This is the fall. Part of the implication of the fall in traditional Christian theology is that we have to labor hard. You know, thorns and thistles, the ground is unproductive to us. This is a struggle. And then, of course, if you like, the positive side, whether we're talking about the Puritans' work ethic, but I mean, work ethic has been a central thing. I think the Puritans haven't haven't trademarked the notion of hard work as a way to live with dignity. And yeah, I mean, it seems to me there's a happy correlation. If you need to get the job because of your economic situation, it's provided because of the nature of the economy, jobs are there. You have some sort of fulfillment in doing it because it isn't totally grim. And this helps you feel fulfilled as a human being. But aligning those things is something of an accident of recent history I think, for most people. I mean, most people's work has been utterly grim in the past. I mean, 19th century, you know, mills and all this kids and chimney sweeps and goodness as well. And much of the world is exactly the same situation now. In very much 19th century British sort of struggles, you know, with working conditions. So I don't want to idealize, you know, the dignity of work. Work is not very dignified if you're in Nepal and you're 8 years old and you're sewing carpets all day or whatever it is. But I think the church, well, if the church could just get a bit interested in the modern world and in thinking ahead, wouldn't it be fascinating to have some kind of fresh theological framing of the dignity of service in a context in which it might or might not be connected with a pay packet and with retirement and health and all the other things that typically come to those who work as something which is separate. And I mean, plainly, we have the Western economies are developed in a way which we have all these. I was invited to a meeting at 10 Downing Street about this about a year ago, and they said, what can we do? I said, well, okay, just precautionarily, because this could happen, you know. Well, full-time, part-time distinctions at work. You know, the gig economy, you know, people, self-employed people versus employed people. These are huge distinctions in law and taxes and so on. Obviously, doing voluntary work and doing paid work, being retired and not being retired. I mean, there's a whole series of sort of binaries here in the way that our culture has developed. And we need to work to integrate them, to lower the divisions between them, to make moving from one to the other easier and more attractive. There are all kinds of things that the policymakers could do from one end, and I think that Christian thinkers could do from the other end, which would smooth our path into a society. Now, it may well be, coming back to the point, it may well be that we end up with some way to job share and work share and, you know, have, well, there are all these crazy books out there, you know, work the 10-hour week, you know, with somebody's formula. I wouldn't mind working a 10-hour week. I wouldn't mind that at all, as long as I could decide which 10 hours it was. But maybe that's how we're going to end up. Or maybe we should start thinking, if you like, in practical but rather minimalist terms like that. This is not going to destroy employment altogether, but a lot of people are going to end up being what we now call part-time.
Just another thought occurs to me, and is that talk about connecting up the jobs, because in another discussions going on about the fact that we've got all these elderly people who their pensions are shrinking, and they're actually going to have to carry on working for longer. So talk about connecting up the dots. It's interesting, isn't it, how these different conversations are going on in different parts of the society, in different parts of economy, but having that wider perspective. And you can see there is a real challenge here for as you say, fresh theological thinking, that that idleness is not good, that but that I suppose it's a sort of redefinition of work as voluntary work. It's not the same as paid employment. Money may come by universal income. What the really important work is working hard for others, even though you don't get paid for it.
Yeah, I suppose I see two things here. I mean, if I could, I have 5 children, 13 grandchildren now, and so in terms of saying things to them at their different stages, the two things that I think would enable someone to flourish in such an environment are a love of reading, just reading. I mean, you're never bored if you read, and B, a love of service. And I think, the pretty much puts the pieces together that our human nature. And at any level, this is the point. I mean, people who aren't not terribly well educated can absolutely love reading, and it can be enormously important for them. It isn't just for the eggheads to read, but a love of reading. And of course, we live in a society in which reading has not, has pretty much been on the back burner. And I mean, I love Netflix. I don't mind visuals at all. But I mean, if you love to read, and if you love to serve. And maybe we should be structuring our education system not around, STEM and having fewer people pass from A-levels and all sorts of things, whatever you're doing over here in Britain. But maybe we should be restructuring it about around service and reading. But I mean, I think we've got to go back to ad fontem. I mean, back to the start in our discussions about education, and look at producing readers who serve.
But presumably, the people that they serve will be those part of the population who, when faced with lack of meaningful work, sink into depression or alcoholism or whatever. You know what I mean? There's going to be there are going to be two categories, if you like. Those that cope
we're
by
all going to be in this
serving
together.
and so on.
I think some of us will be taking it in turns to serve and be served. But I mean, I have in my head. I wrote a bit about this. I wrote an obituary for Neil Armstrong. Someone was referring to Neil Armstrong. Well, of course, it was probably Martin, was it? Yes. Yeah. I wrote an obituary. I feel closer. We share the same birthday, August the 5th. So I met him once, and of course, when you share a birthday, you have a great conversation. Stephen and I have great conversations, even though we're 2 days apart. I had a great conversation. And anyway, so I wrote an obituary for, and I was thinking about Tennyson. I often think about Tennyson. I'm a Tennyson fan. He's a poet, by the way. And I was thinking about his Lotus Eaters. You mean the Lotus Eaters? It is an absolute classic 19th century poem by people on this island. They're all cast up and they're all basically all spaced out and they're having a great time. And they've forgotten about their wife and they don't want to go home. They're just having a great time. That's Tennyson for you. Verses, his poem Locksley Hall. Locksley Hall, 1832, thereabouts. We probably got some English literature people who know more about this than I do. Locksley Hall is Tennyson's futuristic. It is quoted on the wall of the US House of Representatives Science Committee room. Tennyson would have been quite surprised by this. He's quoted 2 lines of it, stuck up on the wall there. He's looked into the future as far as I could see and so on. It's futurist. He's imagining aeroplanes and goodness knows what. And, you're going to be a Lotus Eater, or you're going to be at Locksley Hall. And he wrote these poems 20 years apart, but I just laid this out. And, Neil Armstrong, moon, all this stuff, which America's turned its back on pretty much. But, I think this is a challenge for us. I mean, do we want to be Lotus Eaters? Because we'll be in a culture, seen the movie WALL-E? I mean, it's marvelous. Since they're all in the space jacket going round and round and round, and they're all getting absolutely huge. I'm sure popping statins like you do on the NHS, so it doesn't really matter. Is that the sort of future you want? Saw a piece yesterday that 70% of unemployed kids in their 20s, spend their whole day watching video games. I mean, some really quite interesting statistic, watching video. I mean, are we going to be Lotus Eaters, or are we going to have a visionary future? And I think those are the choices.
Bob's got a question.
It's more a comment, really, just picking up on something John said. I know when I start conversations with people I've not met before, and maybe many of us have this same experience, one of the first things we say is, what do you do? What's your job?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I guess if you're American, you go on to figure out how much they're earning, which is, being British, we don't do that. But there is something very fundamental in the way we think about people. We sort of pigeonhole them by what they do. So it seems to me that work is deeply ingrained feature of who we are, actually. And I know, speaking to people who have been full-time mothers, haven't been in the paid workplace, but do all kinds of other stuff, sometimes they feel, well, I'm nothing. I don't earn anything. And actually, you want to say, no, that's absolutely not true, of course. You're maybe more important than those of us that are cranking the handle and just getting paid our weekly wages. So I think there is some deep Christian thinking to be done here. And personally, I'm just as guilty. Instead of asking people about themselves and their families and their values and their morals and whatever, I often say, what do you do? I've said that today to people. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
No, I like that, Bob. I mean, because I always make me think of Russians, because Russians, you meet Russians say, I am engineer, it's the first thing they say to you, or I am painter, and the fact that they don't get the article thing, it really makes it even more obvious. Yeah, I mean, the industrial society, like democracy, sadly, industrial society has really been a recent thing and may not be a long-term thing for us. And you go back, I mean, you're thinking back in a Bruegel, if you're in a Bruegel picture and you're, milling around the village square, you don't say, what do you do? I mean, you're all peasants, I mean, you talk about something else, we're peasants, we're back in the fields. Or if you're in China, in rural China, you don't say, what do you do? Well, I'm in the rice business. I mean, this is what you do. I think this is a construct, really quite a recent construct, Western construct, and plainly it's out of kilter. It's out of kilter. And it's interesting, because in America we have this phrase, do you work outside the home? You're very careful how you speak to typically married women, typically women in this situation. One of my one son, he's Mr. Mom. I mean, the American term, he does the domestic side of the family. And it's interesting seeing this, and he's a big sort of guy with tattoos and things, but this is what he does. We have these new patterns emerging, but they're still parasitic on a model of the industrial economy, which is really very recent, and which maybe is just going to go away. And I think it's rather important that we don't, if you like, take our sweat of your brow, eat bread thing, sort of plug it into the Puritan work ethic, model that in the industrial economy, and say the sky is falling because no one has any jobs anymore. I think we've got to open this thing up and understand that vocation actually is not just a matter of, what you're putting on your UCAS form. I mean, that there are other ways to sort of unpick and reconstruct our notions of what we should be doing with ourselves. And as I say, seems to me reading and service, to me, seem to be two perfectly good pillars of the good life. But I go back to this young woman who said, well, does this mean we're going to retire at 22? And I think it would be a very interesting exercise. Maybe someone should go to Templeton or somewhere and say, we'd like, $1 million or $2 million for this. What would it mean for our education system if everyone retired at 22? I think that would be a kind of fun thing to do. So if anyone wants to come along, we'll write a letter and see if see if we get a check back in the mail.
Great, thank you. Any other comments or questions? Okay.
Well, in that case, I will shamelessly promote my little book.
Do so.
Which is presently, thanks to the publisher wanting to have a title called Will Robots Take Your Job? I had all sorts of more sophisticated alternatives, but they reckon that'll sell, which is coming out in the spring from Polity. Thank you very much for staying till the end of the game here so that we could have such fun and being rude about Microsoft and nice about Bill and Melinda Gates. And in coming up with this great grant proposal for an education system that finishes retirement at 22. Thank you very much.